The morning Karen Henderson marched across my lakefront property with a clipboard and a scowl that could sour milk. I was sitting on my dock with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the water gold. I had no idea that in 6 months, I'd be living in a floating ranch house, anchored 50 feet from shore, legally untouchable, and driving her absolutely insane. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all started. My name is David, and 3 years ago, I bought what I thought was paradise, a beautiful 2-acre lakefront property in Pine Ridge Estates, complete with 200 feet of pristine shoreline on Lake Harmony. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Frank, had built a simple wooden dock that extended about 30 feet into the water. Nothing fancy, just weathered cedar planks and sturdy posts driven deep into the lake bottom. The dock came with the property, and according to the county records, it had been there for over 15 years. Frank assured me it was grandfathered in, completely legal, and had never caused any issues with the neighbors or the HOA. The home inspector checked it over, declared it structurally sound, and I fell in love with the idea of morning coffee on the water and evening fishing sessions as the sun set behind the pine trees. For the first 2 years, life was exactly what I'd dreamed. I'd wake up before dawn, brew my coffee, and walk down to the dock to watch the lake come alive. The water would be glass smooth in the early morning, reflecting the sky so perfectly you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Loons would call across the water, their haunting voices echoing off the forested shoreline. Bass would jump, sending concentric circles rippling outward. It was my sanctuary. The other lakefront homeowners were friendly enough. There was Margaret, an artist in her 70s who lived 2 properties down and painted watercolors of the changing seasons. Bob and Susan across the cove had a pontoon boat and would wave whenever they puttered by. Even the HOA seemed reasonable. They maintained the common areas, kept the roads plowed in winter, and stayed out of everyone's business. Then the Hendersons bought the property directly to my north. Karen Henderson was what you might call a woman with opinions. Lots of them. Loud ones. From the moment she and her husband Rick moved in, she appointed herself as the unofficial keeper of neighborhood standards. Within a month, she'd filed complaints about Margaret's garden being too wild, demanded Bob and Susan move their boat lift because it obstructed her view, and somehow convinced the HOA board to ban outdoor clotheslines because they weren't aesthetically pleasing. But she seemed to leave me alone, and I hoped I'd fly under her radar. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in late April when Karen made her first move. I was on the dock as usual, enjoying my coffee and watching a family of ducks paddle by, when I heard the sharp click of heels on the stone path leading to my shoreline. Karen appeared at the edge of my property line, dressed like she was heading to a board meeting rather than walking by a lake-crisp blazer, pencil skirt, and those aggressive heels that announced her presence 20 yards away. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying across the water with the authority of someone who'd never been told no. "I need to speak with you about that dock." I turned slowly, coffee mug in hand, and gave her what I hoped was a neighborly smile. "Good morning, Karen. Beautiful day, isn't it?" She ignored the pleasantries and marched to the water's edge, clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. Up close, I could see she'd printed out what looked like official documents, highlighted in neon yellow and bristling with sticky notes. "This dock," she said, pointing at my peaceful morning sanctuary with the tip of her pen like she was identifying a crime scene, is in violation of multiple HOA covenants and county regulations. I nearly choked on my coffee. "I'm sorry, what?" "I've done my research." She flipped through her papers with the efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. According to the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Agreement, Section 4.2, 1. All waterfront structures require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. This dock was never approved. The morning air suddenly felt cooler. Karen, this dock has been here for over 15 years. It came with the property. It's grandfathered. Grandfathering doesn't apply if the structure violates current safety standards, she interrupted, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who'd found a loophole. And according to my measurements, this dock extends 32 feet into the water, which exceeds the county's 25-foot limitation for residential docks. I stood up slowly, setting my coffee mug on the dock railing. Your measurements? I took the liberty of having it surveyed last week. She pulled out a folded paper with what looked like professional measurements and diagrams. The county inspector will be here Thursday morning at 9 a.m. to assess the violation and issue a removal order. The ducks that had been floating nearby sensed the tension and quietly paddled away toward calmer waters. I felt my chest tighten as the implications hit me. This wasn't just about the dock. This was about Karen establishing dominance, marking her territory, and showing everyone in the neighborhood that she was in charge. Karen, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside me, you had my property surveyed without my permission? The waterfront is community property beyond the high water mark, she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I have every right to ensure our neighborhood maintains its standards and complies with all regulations. I'm sure you understand. No, I didn't understand. I didn't understand how someone could move into a neighborhood and immediately start trying to tear down structures that had existed peacefully for decades. I didn't understand the level of entitlement it took to have someone else's property surveyed behind their back. And I certainly didn't understand why she'd chosen my dock as her first target. But I was about to learn that Karen Henderson didn't need a good reason to start a war. But what I discovered next about her real motivations would make me question everything I thought I knew about property rights and neighborhood politics. Thursday morning arrived with a gray, drizzling rain that matched my mood perfectly. I'd spent the previous 2 days making phone calls, trying to track down the original permits for my dock and contacting the county to understand what I was facing. The news wasn't good. While the dock had indeed been there for years, there was no record of proper permits in the county database. Either they'd been lost over time, or Frank had built it without going through official channels. At exactly 9 a.m., a white county truck pulled into my driveway. I watched from my kitchen window as a thin, tired-looking man in a reflective vest climbed out, followed immediately by Karen emerging from her house like she'd been watching through binoculars. She wore a bright yellow raincoat and carried an oversized umbrella, clearly prepared for an extended outdoor discussion. I grabbed my own jacket and headed down to meet them, my shoes squelching in the wet grass. The inspector introduced himself as Jim Morrison, no relation to the singer, he assured me, with a weary smile that suggested he'd made that clarification thousands of times. So this is the dock in question, Jim said, pulling out a tablet and stylus as we approached the shoreline. The rain had turned the lake surface into a moving canvas of tiny circles, each raindrop creating its own expanding ring before being absorbed into the gray water. That's correct, Karen said, stepping up beside him like she was co-conducting the inspection. As I documented in my complaint, it extends well beyond the legal limit and was constructed without proper permits. Jim walked to the end of the dock, his boots making hollow sounds on the wet planks. He knelt down and began measuring, occasionally making notes on his tablet. I stood there feeling like a defendant, waiting for a verdict, the rain soaking through my jacket collar. Well, Jim said finally, straightening up and wiping rainwater from his screen, it's definitely over the 25-foot limit. I'm showing 31 feet, 6 inches from the high water mark to the end of the structure. Karen's smile was triumphant. And the permits? No record of permits on file, Jim confirmed, though he sounded apologetic about it. However, he added, looking at me with what might have been sympathy, there are options for addressing this without complete removal. My heart lifted slightly. What kind of options? You can apply for a retroactive permit and bring the structure into compliance. That would mean shortening it to 25 feet or less. It's not cheap, but it's better than losing the whole dock. Karen's smile faltered. This clearly wasn't the outcome she'd been hoping for. But surely there are fines for the violation? Well, yes, Jim admitted reluctantly. There's a standard fine for unpermitted structures and daily penalties until it's brought into compliance. But if Mr. Davidson, I supplied. If Mr. Davidson begins the compliance process within 30 days, we can waive the daily penalties and reduce the initial fine. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, almost as refreshing as the rain. This wasn't the disaster Karen had orchestrated. It was fixable, manageable, even if it would cost me a few $1,000s I hadn't budgeted for. 30 days, I repeated. I can work with that. Karen, however, looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. What about the safety concerns? I have children visiting my property. An unpermitted structure could be dangerous. Jim glanced at the dock, then back at Karen. Ma'am, I've been inspecting waterfront structures for 12 years. This dock is solid as a rock. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. The only issue is the length and the paperwork. As Jim packed up his equipment and headed back to his truck, Karen lingered at the edge of my property. The rain had intensified, drumming against her umbrella with increasing urgency, but she seemed reluctant to leave without having the last word. 30 days, she said, her voice carrying a warning that made my skin crawl. That's not very long to navigate county bureaucracy. Permits can take months to process. Contractors are backed up all summer, and there are so many ways things can go wrong. I looked at her standing there in her yellow raincoat, water dripping from the edges of her umbrella, and realized this was far from over. Karen hadn't gotten the immediate victory she'd wanted, but she wasn't giving up. If anything, the inspector's reasonable response had only made her more determined to find another way to get rid of my dock. I'll manage, I said simply. We'll see, she replied, and there was something in her tone that sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain. As she walked back toward her property, heels clicking wetly on the stone path, I couldn't shake the feeling that this dock inspection had just been round one. But I had no idea she'd already started making phone calls that would turn my simple permit application into a bureaucratic nightmare. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in bureaucratic frustration. What should have been a straightforward permit application turned into a maze of red tape, conflicting requirements, and mysterious delays that all seemed designed to eat up my 30-day deadline. First, the county informed me that I needed an environmental impact study before they could process the permit. This was news to me, and apparently to Jim Morrison, who'd never mentioned it during the inspection. The study would take 6 to 8 weeks and cost $2,500. When I called to ask why this hadn't been mentioned initially, I was transferred between 4 different departments before being told that new regulations had just been implemented. Then I discovered that the environmental study required approval from the state's Department of Natural Resources, which was currently backlogged and not accepting new applications for at least 2 months. When I pointed out that my deadline was in 9 days, the clerk on the phone suggested I speak with my county commissioner about requesting an extension. The county commissioner's office told me they could only grant extensions for permits that had already been submitted, and I couldn't submit my permit without the environmental study. It was a perfect bureaucratic catch-22. I spent my days on hold, my evenings researching regulations, and my sleepless nights wondering if this was what Karen had meant when she'd said there were so many ways things can go wrong. The coincidence of all these new requirements and unexpected delays was starting to feel less like bad luck and more like orchestrated sabotage. My suspicions were confirmed on a Friday afternoon when I stopped by the county building in person, determined to speak with someone face to face who could help me navigate this mess. As I sat in the waiting area outside the permit office, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Henderson called again this morning. A woman was saying to her colleague, she wants to make sure we're following proper environmental protocols for all lakefront structures. Apparently, there have been some concerns about water quality and fish spawning areas. That's the third time this week, the other woman replied. She's really on top of these issues. Karen had been calling the county, raising concerns that were creating additional hurdles for my permit. She was using her apparent expertise in regulations and her aggressive persistence to make sure my simple dock compliance became as complicated and time-consuming as possible. When I finally got in to speak with the permit coordinator, a harried-looking woman named Beth, she confirmed my worst fears. "Mr. Davidson, I have to be honest with you," she said, looking uncomfortable. "We've received several calls expressing concerns about your dock's environmental impact. While these concerns may not have merit, we're legally required to investigate them thoroughly before approving any permits." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Potential disruption to fish habitats, possible water contamination from treated lumber, impact on wetland vegetation." She trailed off, seeing the expression on my face. "Look, between you and me, most of these concerns are pretty standard for any dock that's been in place for years. But the person raising them seems very knowledgeable about environmental law, and they've cited specific statutes that we have to address." I left the county building feeling defeated and angry. My 30-day deadline was now 6 days away, and I was further from compliance than when I'd started. Karen had turned a simple permit application into a legal and environmental obstacle course, and she was winning. That evening, I sat on my dock possibly for one of the last times watching the sun set over the lake and trying to figure out my next move. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and pink clouds like a mirror. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows nearby, waiting with infinite patience for the right moment to strike. As I watched the heron, an idea began to form. Karen was using the system against me, weaponizing bureaucracy and environmental concerns to get what she wanted. But maybe I was thinking about this all wrong. Maybe instead of fighting her game, I needed to change the game entirely. I pulled out my phone and started researching something I'd heard about, but never seriously considered: floating structures. Specifically, floating homes and the maritime laws that governed them. What I found was fascinating. While land-based structures were subject to local zoning laws, building codes, and HOA regulations, floating structures anchored in navigable waters fell under maritime law, which was federal jurisdiction. The county couldn't regulate them, the HOA couldn't control them, and Karen Henderson certainly couldn't complain about permits. But I didn't know that Karen had been watching me through binoculars all week, documenting my suspicious behavior and preparing her next assault. And what she had planned would make her previous efforts look like friendly suggestions. Monday morning brought the deadline, and Karen brought reinforcements. I was on my dock at sunrise, trying to enjoy what might be my last peaceful morning there, when I heard the crunch of multiple vehicles in my driveway. Through the morning mist, I could see Karen's silver SUV, followed by a white van marked P, INERIDGEST, a TESCSE, CURIT, Y, and a black pickup truck with official-looking emblems. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter as I realized Karen had escalated this beyond county regulations. She'd brought in the HOA's private security and what looked like some kind of enforcement officer. This wasn't about permits anymore. This was about power. I walked back to meet them, my bare feet cold on the dewy grass. Karen emerged from her SUV like a general arriving at a battlefield, clipboard in one hand and a thick folder of documents in the other. She was flanked by a security guard who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and a burly man in a uniform I didn't recognize. "Mr. Davidson, Karen announced loudly enough for any neighbors to hear. "Your 30-day compliance period has expired." As president of the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association Board, I'm here to inform you that your unpermitted dock is now subject to immediate removal. President? I stopped walking. Since when are you president of the HOA? Karen's smile was sharp as a blade. Since last Wednesday's emergency board meeting. The previous president, unfortunately, had to step down due to health issues. The board unanimously appointed me to serve the remainder of his term. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The previous president, a retired engineer named Tom Peterson, had been reasonable and level-headed. He'd served for 3 years without any major controversies. And now, suddenly, he'd stepped down for health issues right in the middle of my dock crisis? "Let me introduce you to Mr. Williams," Karen continued, gesturing to the burly man beside her. "He's a certified enforcement officer for waterfront violations. And this is Derek from our security company. They're here to oversee the dock's removal." Williams stepped forward, consulting a handheld device that looked like an oversized smartphone. "Sir, I need to inform you that this structure is now considered a public safety hazard and an environmental violation. You have 2 hours to remove any personal property before we begin demolition." Demolition? The word came out louder than I'd intended. "You can't just tear down my dock. I have property rights." I was working on the permit. "The permit deadline has passed," Karen interrupted. "And as HOA president, I have both the authority and the obligation to ensure all structures in our community comply with safety and environmental standards." The board voted unanimously to authorize immediate removal. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Ma'am, shouldn't we wait for the property owner to have a chance to respond? Maybe get his side of it?" "Derek," Karen's voice, "could have frozen the lake in July. I'm paying your company to provide security services, not legal advice. Please do your job." I looked at Williams, who was now taking photos of my dock with a professional-grade camera. "What authority do you have here? This is private property." "Sir, I'm a certified marine safety inspector contracted by the HOA. When waterfront structures pose a risk to community safety or environmental health, I have the authority to order immediate remediation." It was a beautiful setup. Karen had maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency, hired an enforcement officer who specialized in waterfront violations, and created a legal framework that gave her the power to destroy my dock. She'd turned the Homeowners Association into her personal demolition company. But something about the whole scene felt off. Williams kept checking his phone and looking toward the road like he was expecting someone. Derek, the security guard, seemed more confused than authoritative, and Karen, despite her commanding performance, had a nervous energy that suggested she wasn't as confident as she appeared. "I want to see the board minutes from this emergency meeting," I said, "and I want to contact Tom Peterson directly about his resignation." "The meeting minutes are confidential until they're approved at the next monthly meeting," Karen replied quickly. "And Tom is recuperating and doesn't want to be disturbed. Then I want to call an emergency meeting of all homeowners to discuss this action. That requires a petition signed by 30% of property owners and 30 days' notice," she shot back without hesitation. She clearly anticipated every move I might make. As we stood there in the morning mist, facing off like gunfighters at high noon, Williams's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, and stepped away to take a call. I couldn't hear the conversation, but his body language changed from confident to concerned to something approaching panic. When he hung up and walked back toward us, his entire demeanor had shifted. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, his voice carefully neutral, "I need to speak with you privately for a moment." They walked a few steps away, but I could see Karen's face change as Williams whispered urgently in her ear. Her triumphant expression faded to confusion, then to something that looked suspiciously like fear. After a brief, heated exchange, Williams returned to where I was standing. "Sir, there's been a development in your case. I'm not authorized to proceed with a removal at this time. There are some jurisdictional questions that need to be resolved." Karen marched back over, her face flushed with anger. "What jurisdictional questions?" "This is a clear violation. Ma'am, I can't discuss the details, but I've been advised to halt all enforcement actions pending further review." As Williams and Derek packed up their equipment and left, Karen stood alone in my driveway, her carefully orchestrated demolition falling apart around her. But the look she gave me as she climbed back into her SUV wasn't defeat, it was pure, concentrated rage. "This isn't over," she called out through her open window. "Not even close." As her tires kicked up gravel and she sped away, I realized that whatever had just saved my dock was probably only a temporary reprieve. But I also realized something else. Karen's overconfidence had revealed just how far she was willing to go to win. And that gave me exactly the information I needed to beat her at her own game. The next morning, I drove to Tom Peterson's house with a box of his favorite donuts from the bakery downtown and a head full of questions. Tom lived on the far side of the lake, in a modest cabin he'd built himself after retiring from 30 years as a structural engineer. If anyone would give me straight answers about the HOA situation, it would be him. I found Tom in his workshop, bent over a birdhouse he was crafting from reclaimed cedar. At 72, he was still sharp as a tack and stronger than men half his age. He looked up when I knocked on the open door, and his expression immediately shifted to something between embarrassment and anger. "David," he said, setting down his chisel. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Tom, what the hell happened?" "Karen says you resigned for health reasons, but you look fine to me." Tom wiped his hands on a rag and gestured for me to sit on a workbench stool. "That woman is a piece of work, I'll give her that. She didn't get me to resign exactly. She got me removed." "How?" "Emergency board meeting last Wednesday, like she said. But what she didn't mention is that she called it for 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, with exactly 24 hours notice as required by the bylaws. She knew damn well that Pete Martinez works construction and couldn't make it, and that Sarah Chen had a standing doctor's appointment. Pete and Sarah were the other 2 board members I'd voted for in the last election. Both reasonable people who'd never shown any interest in harassing homeowners over minor violations. So who was there? Just me, Karen, and her husband Rick. She nominated Rick to fill the vacant secretary position. Apparently the previous secretary had stepped down the week before, though nobody bothered to tell me. Then, she and Rick voted to remove me as president for failing to address community safety concerns and neglecting fiduciary responsibilities. I felt sick. She staged a coup. A perfectly legal coup, according to the bylaws. She found every loophole, every procedural technicality, and used them to take over the entire board. Rick's the secretary, she's the president, and they appointed her sister-in-law as treasurer. The 3 of them now control every decision affecting our neighborhood. What about Pete and Sarah? They're still technically on the board, but they can't vote on anything if they don't show up to meetings. And Karen schedules meetings at times when she knows they can't attend. I thought about the enforcement officer who'd shown up to demolish my dock, then suddenly received a phone call that changed everything. "Tom, do you know anything about jurisdictional issues with waterfront properties?" Tom's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "Funny you should ask. You remember my nephew, Jake? The one who's a maritime lawyer up in Seattle?" I nodded, though I'd only met Jake briefly at a neighborhood barbecue the previous summer. "Well, Jake was visiting last weekend when I told him about your dock situation. He got real interested when I mentioned that Karen was claiming authority over waterfront structures. started asking questions about property lines, navigable waters, federal jurisdiction, and he made some phone calls Monday morning. Turns out your property situation is more complex than any of us realized. The shoreline along this section of the lake falls under federal maritime jurisdiction because it's connected to the river system that eventually leads to the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean. My heart started racing. This was exactly what I'd been researching, but hearing it from a maritime lawyer gave it weight I couldn't have achieved on my own. What does that mean, practically? It means that structures anchored in the water beyond the high tide mark are subject to federal maritime law, not local zoning codes or HOA regulations. Karen can complain all she wants about your dock, but if you anchor it properly and follow Coast Guard requirements, there's nothing she or the county can do about it. But my dock is attached to the shore. Tom grinned. That's why Jake called the enforcement officer Monday morning. Turns out, Williams isn't certified for maritime enforcement, only for land-based waterfront violations. The moment your structure becomes a floating vessel, anchored in navigable waters, it's completely outside his authority. The pieces were falling into place. Karen had assumed she could use local authorities and HOA regulations to control my dock, but she'd overlooked the fundamental question of jurisdiction. Water rights and maritime law created a completely different set of rules she couldn't manipulate or control. Tom, I said slowly, what if I told you I was thinking about building something bigger than a dock? Something that would be entirely in the water, outside of any local jurisdiction? His grin widened. I'd say that sounds like the kind of engineering challenge I haven't had in years. And I'd ask when we start. As I drove home that afternoon, my mind was spinning with possibilities. Karen had declared war on my simple dock, thinking she could use bureaucracy and intimidation to force me off the water. But she'd made a critical error. She'd underestimated both my determination and my resources. And she had no idea what was about to float into her perfect view of the lake. That evening, I spread marina blueprints, maritime law documents, and engineering sketches across my dining room table like a general planning a campaign. Tom had been right about this being an engineering challenge, but it was also a legal and logistical puzzle that required careful coordination of multiple moving parts. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Build a floating structure that would serve as both home and boat, anchored in federally protected waters, beyond the reach of HOA regulations or county codes. Under maritime law, as long as the structure was properly registered as a vessel and met Coast Guard safety requirements, it would be completely legal and untouchable. But this wasn't just about beating Karen at her own game, though the satisfaction of that was undeniable. Living on the water had always appealed to me, and the idea of waking up to sunrise over the lake every morning, rocking gently with the natural rhythm of the water, felt like the ultimate expression of the peaceful lakefront lifestyle I'd originally sought. Tom arrived the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a rolled bundle of architectural drawings that had clearly been modified and updated multiple times over the years. I've been thinking about floating homes since I retired, he admitted, as we walked down to my dock. Always wanted to try building one, but my wife thought I was crazy. After she passed last year, I started sketching out some designs. Just for fun, you understand. We spread the drawings on my dock, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs and fishing tackle boxes. What Tom had designed was remarkable, a sleek, modern structure that looked more like a luxury yacht than a traditional houseboat. Solar panels covered the roof, windows wrapped around 3 sides for panoramic views, and the whole thing was designed to float stable and level regardless of water conditions. The key is the hull design, Tom explained, pointing to cross-section diagrams that looked like something from a naval architecture firm. Twin pontoons with a shallow draft, so it can handle low water in late summer, but wide enough for stability in rough weather. The living space sits between the pontoons, with the main structure about 4 feet above the waterline. How big? I asked, already imagining myself living in this floating paradise. 1,200 square feet. Full kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, and a great room with those wraparound windows. Deck space on 3 sides. And here's the beautiful part, since it's classified as a vessel, you can anchor it anywhere in federally navigable waters. No permits, no HOA approval, no county regulations. I studied the drawings, marveling at the attention to detail. Tom had thought of everything: gray water collection, freshwater storage, electrical systems, even a small dock platform that would extend from one side for easy access from shore. What about construction? Timeline? Cost? That's where it gets interesting, Tom said, with a mischievous glint in his eye. I've got contacts from my engineering days who specialize in marina construction. The hull and basic structure could be prefabricated off-site and assembled here in about 6 weeks. Total cost, including materials, labor, and Coast Guard certification, would run about $120,000. It wasn't cheap, but it was less than I'd paid for my kitchen renovation 2 years earlier, and infinitely more valuable than dealing with Karen's harassment for the rest of my life. When could we start? I made some calls yesterday, Tom grinned. If you're serious about this, I can have the fabrication crew here Monday morning to start on the hull. While they're working, we can handle the permits and registration with the Coast Guard. The whole thing could be floating and habitable by Labor Day. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, I could be living in a floating home that Karen Henderson had absolutely no authority over, anchored in water that was completely outside her jurisdiction. The poetry of it was irresistible. Let's do it. Tom extended his hand, and we shook on it there on my old dock, with the morning sun painting the lake gold and the loons calling across the water like they were cheering us on. But as we rolled up the plans and headed back toward shore, neither of us noticed Karen, standing at her upstairs window with binoculars, watching our every move and making notes in a leather-bound journal. Her next move would test the limits of both maritime law and neighborly tolerance. Monday morning brought the first truck at 6:30 a.m., sharp, a massive flatbed carrying prefabricated aluminum pontoons that gleamed like silver bullets in the early morning light. By 7 a.m., 3 more trucks had arrived, along with a crew of 6 workers who moved with the efficient precision of people who'd done this type of specialized construction dozens of times before. The crew chief, a weathered man named Marcus, who'd spent 20 years building everything from fishing boats to luxury yachts, walked the shoreline with Tom and me, surveying the site and planning the assembly process. "Beautiful spot," he said, squinting across the water toward the far shore where morning mist still clung to the pine trees. "Deep water, good protection from the prevailing winds, easy access for materials. We'll stage everything on your lawn, assemble the basic structure on shore, then use the crane to lift it into the water." The crane he referenced was currently being unloaded from its own specialized trailer, a massive yellow machine that could lift 30 tons and extend its arm 50 feet in any direction. Watching it unfold was like seeing a mechanical dinosaur wake up and stretch. By mid-morning, my peaceful lakefront property had been transformed into an industrial construction site. Workers in hard hats and safety vests swarmed over the components, welding pontoons together and assembling the steel framework that would support the living quarters. The air filled with the sounds of power tools, welding torches, and the steady beep, beep, beep of vehicles backing up. And Karen hated every minute of it. She appeared at our shared property line around 10 a.m., dressed in what looked like a business suit despite the construction noise and diesel fumes. Her expression could have stopped the crane in its tracks. "This is completely unacceptable," she announced, loud enough to be heard over the welding. The noise ordinance clearly states that construction activities cannot begin before 8 a.m. or exceed 60 decibels at the property line. Marcus looked up from the pontoon he'd been inspecting. "Ma'am, we started at 7:30, and we're well within noise limits. I've got a decibel meter if you'd like to check. I don't care about your meter. This disruption is affecting the peaceful enjoyment of my property. I'm calling the sheriff." "That's your right," Marcus replied mildly, then turned back to his work. But Karen wasn't finished. "What exactly are you building here? I don't see any permits posted, and I certainly wasn't notified of any construction projects as required by HOA covenants." This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I walked over with a folder containing all the documentation Tom and I had assembled over the past week. "Karen, this is a vessel construction project under federal maritime jurisdiction. The Coast Guard has all the appropriate documentation, and since the finished structure will be anchored in navigable waters, no local permits are required." Her eyes narrowed as she flipped through the Coast Guard forms, federal registration documents, and maritime safety certifications. She clearly hadn't expected this level of legal preparation. "This is ridiculous. You can't just build a boat in your backyard." "Actually, I can," I replied, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. Maritime law is very clear on this point. As long as the vessel meets federal safety standards and is registered properly, construction can take place anywhere with appropriate access to navigable waters.